Okay, this section is about runway incursion avoidance, and the objective is for us to develop knowledge of how to avoid runway incursions. And there are many fatal accidents that occur due to runway incursions, and it's something that's easy to prevent with just a little bit of common knowledge. Some overview on runway incursions. There are, on average, 3 runway incursions a day in the United States, which some of those are fatal, and the FAA considers that way too much. So they place some special emphasis on runway incursions, and some additional training goes into it. A runway incursion is defined as the incorrect presence of another aircraft, a person, or a vehicle in the protected space of an aerodrome that is reserved for takeoff or landing. There's typically 3 types of runway incursions. The first type is due to a pilot deviation. Pilot deviations are usually crossing a runway without a clearance and taking off or landing on a runway when not authorized. The second type of runway incursion would be what's called a operation incident, and that's usually where ATC is involved. They've either issued an aircraft clearance to take off on a runway in which another aircraft is trying to land, or air traffic control has issued a takeoff clearance to an aircraft where a vehicle or another aircraft is already on the runway. And then the third type of incursion usually occurs from a vehicle. The vehicle is on the runway or crossing a hold short line when they weren't authorized to. Some of the elements that we're going to talk about as far as an overview goes, there's some challenges unique to taxiing. There's a lot more aviation traffic now than there used to be. What do we do while we're in a cockpit? Where should we be looking? Are there any references that we should have? What do we need to do in terms of clearances? What types of markings should we know? Steering, maneuvering, maintaining the taxiway center line, and having situational awareness. We'll talk about that in detail, some techniques involved. Hold short lines. Those are probably the most important of all of this. When are we authorized to hold short? Or when are we authorized to cross a hold short line? When do we require further authorization? Towered airports, that's where we're usually going to get our clearances. Untowered airports, we're going to be responsible for our own runway incursion avoidance. And what do we need to know to be able to make those decisions on our own? And what type of exterior lights do we need to be using? And how do we take extra care and precaution for night operations? Challenges unique to taxiing. When we taxi an aircraft, we have several things that we need to keep in mind. And it's become, there's more and more traffic now that is at our airports than ever. And so we need to keep a few things in mind to make sure that we're safe. The complexity of an airport has had a lot to do with some of these incursions. Whenever we have runway thresholds that are close together, that can be a problem. Whenever we have runways that can also be dually used as taxiways, we have a problem. And some things that we need to pay particular attention to are the airport facility directory, which the airport facility directory points out some particular taxiways and hotspots where incursions are likely to occur. And those hotspots are, we'll talk about those a little bit later. NOTAMs. NOTAMs are very important because the airport NOTAMs can let us know of runway closures, taxiway closures, and other things pertinent to when we are determining our taxi route. The next thing that we want to pay particular attention to is the ATIS broadcast. We all know what an ATIS broadcast is. The section towards the end of the ATIS broadcast, after we get our conditions, will list also closed taxiways, any kind of shortages to runway distance, any closed runways, and other pertinent information that we need to know when we do our taxi planning. Okay, we're going to talk about appropriate cockpit activities, and the most important thing to keep in mind is that the pilot's workload needs to be at a minimum when we're taxiing the aircraft, because we need all of our awareness outside of the cockpit. So a couple things to keep in mind is we need a standard operating procedure when we taxi, and the standing operating procedure would consist of some ways that we approach the taxi. A couple of things to keep in mind with that are any kind of pre-taxi checklist or any kind of checklist that we use need to be completed before taxi or after we stop. The other thing is we don't need to put our heads down at any time while we're taxiing. If there's anything that would cause a distraction, that we would need to put our head down or look away from our field of vision outside the aircraft. We would need to stop the aircraft, or we can always ask ATC if we need to stop the aircraft, or if we could stop the aircraft. So that's pretty important to keep in mind. The other thing is we need to have a sterile cockpit when we're taxiing, so any kind of distractions such as informal, unnecessary communications, any type of talking on the phone or texting, just like if we were driving a car, we shouldn't be doing those things when we're taxiing the aircraft. So then we get into our taxi planning, which is basically we come up with a taxi plan, we review that plan, and then we give a briefing on how we're going to taxi. When we plan our route, we need a current copy of the AFD that's going to have our taxi diagram in it. We need our NOTAMs that are pertinent to taxiways and runways, and we also need to listen to the ATIS broadcast, and that'll be very important in determining the route that we have. Based on the runway in use, a lot of times we can plan ahead before we even speak with ATC and get an idea of how they might route us, so we can kind of plan ahead a little bit in regards to that and maybe take a look at expected taxiways. The next thing that we're going to do is we're going to review. And the way that we review is when ATC gives us instructions, we're going to write those instructions down at all times. And when we write down our taxi instructions, it gives us the opportunity to brief those later on after we're done with the review. If we have any kind of confusion or any questions in regards to our taxi instructions, we can certainly always ask ATC for some clarification. And they're not always the most patient of people. However, I personally don't have any issues asking something twice, just for my own safety and the safety of others. Another option that we could use is a progressive taxi, and at very complex or unfamiliar airports, even if we do have a airport facility directory with a taxi diagram, we might have some issues with being able to get around. If we ask air traffic control for a progressive taxi, what they do is they provide us with step-by-step instructions in real time as we taxi. So that's always an option that's available. One thing when we brief also, and we verbally verify that we know our taxi route, we will do a complete readback of the taxi route to air traffic control. So what that does is it eliminates confusion on our part or their part, and allows them, if they made any mistakes after our readback, to make any kind of corrections. So the other thing with a review that's important, or with a briefing rather, is we need to take a look at alert areas on that taxi diagram, the hot spots, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Those hot spots are crucial. We need to have a heightened sense of awareness when we're near those areas after we briefed them. Okay, when we taxi near other aircraft, that's when another hazardous potential exists. As we taxi, we kind of need to be in a continuous loop of that involves situational awareness, upcoming hot spots, upcoming hold short lines, whether those be hold short of further taxiing, hold short of runways, hold short of areas that are cleared, or areas that are protected for approaching aircraft, or areas that are protected for aircraft that are approaching using instrument approaches. One thing that we need to keep in mind when it comes to other aircraft is they might have similar call signs, and we need to maintain special vigilance for that as well, because we don't want to follow the clearance or taxi instructions for another aircraft inadvertently causing a runway incursion. Okay, steering to include maneuvering, maintaining the runway center line, the runway position, and any kind of situational awareness. Well, first thing we'll talk about is the steering. Steering involves us using the rudder pedals in the aircraft, which we need to maintain our feet on at all times, and maintaining the center line. And the best way to do it is, since we do kind of, in our particular aircraft, do sit a little bit off center, we want to maintain that center line in reference to our right leg, because it's closest to the center of the longitudinal axis of the aircraft. That's what we want to maintain. A couple of other things as far as maintaining position. We always want to keep eyes outside the cockpit, because visual cues are provided to us, such as the taxiway information, any kind of intersections, hold short lines, and that helps us maintain our position. In low visibility situations, we want to make sure that we pay attention to the lighting and have appropriate knowledge of the types of lighting that are available for us. And we want to use things like our heading indicator or our compass, if we had to use that, to kind of give us an idea of our situational awareness rather. The other thing is too, we can always stop and ask if we're unsure. We don't want to stop on a runway. That's definitely a no-no. We want to make sure that if we're given a clearance to cross a runway, that we go ahead and make it through the runway. But at any other time, we can stop and ask for any kind of clarification if we would need it. And that'll help us out with our situational awareness as well. Okay, we're going to talk a little about hold shorts, the clearances, the markings and indications. And it's probably one of the most important things for runway incursion avoidance. And the premise behind this, if you'll notice here, is we have a series of dash lines and a straight line, and it's pretty simple to understand. If I'm on the side with the dash lines, okay, I can proceed through that area. So if I was coming off of a runway onto a taxiway, I'm authorized to proceed through that area. If I'm on the other side of the line with a solid line, I require a clearance at a towered airport, or at a non-towered airport. There can't be any kind of aircraft on final approach or on that runway for me to proceed beyond this line. Now, there are a few things other than that can help me out a little bit, kind of give me some indications. Just a few reminders. Kind of like how when you're on a highway and it might be a long stretch of highway and it comes to a T intersection, and they put some things on the road that kind of make your tires make some noise a little bit, so that you can kind of snap out of it if you're daydreaming and realize that you're going to have to slow down. One is the enhanced taxiway lines. It looks kind of like this. And you have a normal taxiway down here. The enhanced one up here is going to have some lines that come off to the side like that. The last 150 feet. That's your enhanced taxiways. For the last 150 feet, you'll see that. You automatically know that you've got to come to a stop, and this kind of helps out with being in a continuous loop of knowing, having situational awareness and knowing what's going on around you. It helps. Another one would be, as we were approaching, we would see, and I'm actually going to turn the point of view over this way real quick, help us to understand is, if we were approaching a runway, we might see a marking that looks kind of like this here. Tells us that we're on taxiway Alpha, and then we would see pretty much the same thing that we would normally see on the ground there. Pretty much the same kind of markings. There's also such thing as what's called an elevated runway guard light, and the elevated runway guard light is just a flashing yellow light that is pretty much placed on top of the, it's just elevated. The next thing is there can be in-ground lights, same kind of yellow lights that look like that. And they just serve as a reminder to us that, hey, I got to receive a clearance. So now let's talk about the clearances for a second. 91123 of Federal Aviation Regulation tells us that if we receive a clearance from ATC, we have to adhere to it. That means when we get a hold short clearance, we've got to provide a full detailed readback of where we're going to hold short at. So if ATC tells us to hold short runway 10 right at Alpha, we're going to respond to them such and such aircraft, or tower such and such aircraft, holding short runway 10 right at Alpha. So it's a mandatory verbatim readback of all hold short instructions. Now, when could we receive hold short instructions? Well, we can receive hold short instructions for certain areas of the runway. For example, with some instrument approaches, the equipment that's used is sensitive, and they might hold us back further short of the runway than normally. And there might be also a guarded approach area of the runway, and we can be asked to hold short in those areas. Now, the one difference with those areas is unless ATC specifically tells us to hold short at those areas, we don't have to. So that's something to keep in mind. They might also, when we're given taxi instructions, if we have to cross a few runways to get back to the FBO after we've landed, or to get to the active runway, usually they're going to give us our taxi instructions, and they're going to clear us through one runway at a time, unless the runways are extremely close together. So that's something important to keep in mind too. A taxi instruction like that might be taxi Bravo Charlie and hold short or cross runway 32. So after that point, we cross that, we would have to stop after that and receive further clearance. We can receive a land and hold short request. They ask us if we can land and hold short. We will see the same markings as actually on the runway after we land. It's up to us to determine whether or not that we can comply with that land and hold short. We have to know the available runway distance, whether we can land in that distance. We're usually not going to receive that kind of request. It's not actually even valid to receive that at night, or air carrier operations are not able to receive that, or if the runways are wet. And that's typically when simultaneous runways that intersect are in use for airports that have authorized land and hold short procedures. But anyways, if we do accept that clearance and we do land, we have to adhere to it. We have to be able to stop before approaching the other runway. And the markings would be the same. They would look something like this on the runway. Of course, we might have just the name of the runway that we're intersecting there, and we wouldn't have these here. We would just have a normal runway center line, but we would have the same barrier here that tells us to stop. So that's important to keep in mind. the land and hold short operations. The other one that's important to cover is a line up and wait. When ATC tells us to line up and wait, it's not a clearance for us to take off. They're just allowing us to get onto the runway. In that case, we would pull onto the runway, we would line up and wait, and it might be for waiting for another aircraft to depart the runway. It could even be something like vortex or wake turbulence avoidance. And I've had that happen to me before. A jet takes off. Rather than have you sit there on the taxiway, they'll tell you to line up and wait. And they line you up and wait, and you're pretty much just going to wait a minute, until it's pretty safe for you to take off. If you're sitting there after a line up and wait and you haven't heard from them after about 90 seconds, it's actually very important that you do contact them and just advise them that you line up and wait, because they make mistakes and they might have just left you out on a runway, and that could be very dangerous. Okay, landing and rollout. Let's talk about that for just a minute. Typically, we land the aircraft. What we want to do is we want to exit at the first available taxiway without having to make any kind of hard braking or any unsafe turning maneuver. So we want to make sure that we're careful with that. The same hold short line will apply to us, except we are authorized, because we are on the double dash side of the line, we are authorized to cross over that line. And it's important that we make sure that the aircraft completely and fully comes over that line as to not interfere with any other aircraft that are conducting operations on that runway. So we come off of our runway. We should see this, and the entire back of the aircraft. Okay, that's the back of our aircraft. Has to be completely clear of that line. So that's a very important thing to keep in mind. All right, and if we have any problems clearing the runway, we need to make sure that we notify ATC immediately as to that, so that they can cancel any clearances for any other aircraft behind us, get any kind of help to us that we might need if it was an emergency situation or whatever. But just for safety's sake, that we need to let them know that right away. A couple of other things to keep in mind. You have some airports where you have runways where the thresholds, displaced threshold, might begin off of another runway, and I'll just draw a picture of that to show you what that looks like. For example, at the Fort Pierce Airport, you've got runway 14, which comes off of runway 10 right. That's another situation, runway 10 right and runway 14. This is another situation where a incursion could happen because someone comes off of a touchdown, say in this area, the touchdown zone elevation, or rather the 1,000-footers, and they come off, and instead of making the first available taxiway, they taxi onto the other runway, and that's a runway incursion as well. So to avoid that, we before we land, we should have some appropriate knowledge of what the runways are supposed to look like, and that's in our AFD. And when we get in, start talking instrument, that kind of stuff is also there's a airport diagram, a runway diagram on our instrument approach plates that we can take a look at. And if we taxi in between parallel runways, which occur in some places, if we pull off onto a taxiway, there's another runway. We obviously can't cross any kind of runways without a clearance, and those hold short markings are there to show us that, and so that's important. Okay, let's talk about operations with a airport with a tower, and a lot of things are already pertinent to what we've talked about. The main additions would be communications with the tower, and there's a couple of different ways to communicate with the tower. One would be through the use of our radio, and the other would be through the use of light gun signals in the event of a radio failure. First we'll talk about is the radio usage. So let's say we wanted to get a clearance to taxi. We were on the movement side of an FBO, or the academy there at the school, and we wanted to be able to taxi into the non-movement side to the active runway. Well, anytime we contact ATC, we want to address them. We want to let them know who we are, where we are, what we have, and what we want. So a sample would be Fort Pierce Tower. This is November 27 Juliet Delta. We're at the Academy ramp with information, ATIS information November, and we'd like to taxi to the nearest available runway for a Southwest VFR departure. That pretty much covers all the key elements of how we want to make our communications to ATC. Now, the other thing to keep in mind, one commonly misused term is the term Roger. Roger basically means that you understand somebody's transmission. It is not an answer to a yes or no question. So if I ask you, would you like to go have a steak tonight? If you replied Roger, that'd be incorrect. The proper terminology is affirmative. You can always tell ATC to stand by, and they'll tell you the same thing in some situations. So if they're trying to give you instructions, and you say to them stand by, it kind of forces them to take a break and let you tend to whatever you're tending to. Another one would be the word unable. So if you're unable to comply with an instruction that ATC gives you, first thing you want to do is you want to tell them unable. So that right there can kind of cause them to maybe re-alter whatever plans they got going on at the moment without getting too much into your business. Talk about light gun signals real quick. Inside the tower there is a gun, not a firearm type gun, but it's a gun. It's a gun that has lights on it, right? They pulled the trigger on it, and it's either going to flash or maintain a steady green light, red light, a alternating green and red light, or a white light. So in the event of lost communications, they still have a way to get through to us. So for example, the colors of the lights and whether they're flashing or not have different meanings if we're in the air or on the ground. So a steady green light on the ground clears us for takeoff. A steady green light, or flashing green light. Hey! Okay, let's talk about operations at airports with an operational control tower. Everything pretty much stays the same along the lines we've been talking about with hold short lines and some of the clearances and whatnot. Really the main thing with ATC is communications. And what we need to understand about communications is obviously radio communications and air traffic control light gun signals. So for radio communications, let's say we're on the non-movement side or on the movement side of a fixed base operator, and we want to get a taxi clearance cruising through the non-movement side to our active runway. What we'll have to do is we'll have to dial in the appropriate ground frequency, and we're going to make a call up. We're going to say, address them, say who we are, where we are, what we have, and what we want. So the way that works is, for example, at Fort Pierce, I would say Fort Pierce Tower. This is Cessna Juliet 25 Delta. We're at the Academy ramp with information November, and we'd like to taxi to the active runway for a VFR departure. That's a sample. Now, some things, one common misconception is the use of the word Roger. Roger is not a yes or no answer to a question. So if I asked you if you'd like a steak for dinner and you said Roger, you'd be incorrect. Roger is just a reply that you understand what someone has said. A couple other things would be the term standby. Standby means to a controller that they kind of have to take a break. If they ask you a question, you might not be in a position to answer, so you tell them to stand by, and they'll tell you the same thing. If they issue you a clearance and you're not able to comply with it, you can always say unable. That's another important communication feature. So now we'll talk about light gun signals for just a second. A light gun is either inside the tower. The controllers have access to kind of like a giant flashlight with different colored lenses on it that you can see from a long distance away. So if they lose communications with you, they'll bust out the light gun. It either has flashing or steady, green lights, red lights, alternating red and green lights, or like a clear amber light. And the meanings of those light gun signals will be different depending on if you're on the ground or in the air. So, for example, hold on. Okay, if I have a steady green light on the ground, that means I'm cleared for takeoff. If I have a steady green light in the air, I'm clear to land. If I have a flashing green light on the ground, I'm clear to taxi. A flashing green light in the air tells me to go ahead and return to land. So if I'm in the pattern and making laps around that green light, tells me I can come in. Or if I'm not even in the pattern, if I'm kind of out of the way, they hit me with that flashing green light, I know to enter the pattern. If I have a steady red light on the ground, that means stop. I've actually seen one of those before. A situation I had was left one morning, crossed into it was before the tower was open, just a few minutes before the tower was open. I crossed into the non-movement area after making my appropriate radio calls that we do for non-towered airports or airports when the tower's closed. I crossed into there. I guess the guys had finally showed up to work and maybe started a minute or two early, and they hit me with that red light gun signal as I was going down the taxiway. I stopped the aircraft immediately, and they advised them of my intentions. They gave me a clearance. I was able to taxi. No big deal, because they hadn't even opened yet, so I was okay. A solid red in the air means I need to give way to other aircraft to continue circling. So I definitely don't want to try and land under those circumstances. If I have a flashing red on the ground, that means exit the runway. So that means I've landed. After I had that green light, given permission to land, they hit me with that flashing red light, and that means, hey, get off the runway at the next available taxiway. If I've got a flashing red light, flashing red light in the air, that means that the airport's unsafe, don't land. And if I get alternating red and green flashing lights, that means exercise extreme caution. For what reason, we may not know, but we need to have our head on a swivel and be on the lookout. And if I get a flashing white light, that means I return to my starting point on the runway, or my starting point at the airport, rather. So let's say I'm in a situation. So let's use another scenario here. Let's say I've received a taxi clearance up to the hold short line for a particular runway that I'm going to depart, and I don't hear anything from ATC when I tell them that I'm ready to depart. I ask for permission to take off, and I don't hear anything. Well, before I assume that there's a radio failure, I might want to double check my frequency, double check the squelch on my radios, and I might want to check the volume, check my headset, and make every effort in which to make sure it's not any kind of issue that I can control. If I determine that there's a radio failure, I'd like to try and turn the aircraft a little bit towards to where the tower can see some of the lights on the aircraft. Because what I'm going to do is I'm going to flash my lights on and off, especially my landing lights because they're bright. I'm going to flash those lights on and off to try and get the attention of the tower. They might be distracted. This could take a couple of minutes, but I'm going to wait until I get some kind of light gun signals. I'm not just going to say, well, I've got a radio failure. I have to go down the runway to taxi and turn around, or just make my own taxi instructions in that case. I'm not going to do that, because that's probably how a few runway incursions occur every year. So after a while, too, any of the aircraft behind me might be able to relay a message for me or whatnot, because they're wanting to depart and take off. I could always try and make any kind of call to tower on my cell phone or whatnot. So that's something else important to consider when it comes to communications with the tower. Okay, let's talk about operations at airports that don't have an operating control tower. There's a few things that we want to keep in mind to avoid runway incursions. And we need to do proper planning. Information located in the AFD would be important, such as the traffic pattern. Usually we have left-hand patterns, but some particular runways, for whatever reason, might have us fly right-hand patterns. So that's something that we need to know right off the bat. And we need to know what the pattern altitude is, of course. A couple of things to keep in mind. When we listen to that ATIS broadcast, we might encounter a situation where we have no or very little wind, and aircraft might be using different runways. So it's important for us to monitor the CTAF frequency, which is listed in the AFD for that airport, and hopefully people are announcing their position. We as good pilots would be making our position announcements too, but as soon as we start our engine, when we begin to taxi, approach a runway, and anywhere from about 10 miles out from that airport, we want to be listening to the CTAF. So that's pretty important. Another thing is, so there's some aircraft that can be flying approaches in VFR conditions, under practice situations, and they might be using a different runway as well. So a key point to keep in mind that we always need to, when we pull up to a runway, to stop and take a look down the approach end of that runway to make sure that there's no oncoming traffic, because some aircraft might not even be equipped with radios. Hard to believe, but with the way that we do aviation, but some people might have small light sport aircraft, whatnot, and they don't even have radios. So we got to keep that in mind. Also, we want to be making sure we're listening to those frequencies and or listening to CTAF frequency and taking a look down a runway, or taking a look when we're crossing over runways as well. So that's the main thing we want to always maintain situational awareness as well. So now we'll finish up with aircraft lighting and night operations. And these things can help with incursion avoidance. A couple things to keep in mind. Whenever we start our engines, we want to have either our rotating beacon on or our anti-collision lights, depending on what our aircraft might be equipped with. And when we're going to taxi, obviously we'll turn on our taxi light. If we stop, we can turn our taxi lights off as a courtesy to other pilots. Strobe lights at night, or strobe lights anytime we have those on, those might be hazardous to other pilots, so we can turn those off in those cases. Our position lights, those need to be on at night. If we're crossing a runway, we want to light the airplane up like a Christmas tree. We turn on all of our lights. Prior to pulling on to the runway for takeoff, we want to make sure that our landing light's on. If we're given a line up and wait clearance, we want to actually align the aircraft as up to 3 feet off of the center line at night. It gives aircraft on final the ability to distinguish us from runway lights, and that's an important thing to keep in mind. when we're at night, we have reduced visibility, obviously, so taxiing can be much more difficult. I'm much more ready to ask for instructions on taxiing, or enhanced, clarified instructions, progressive taxis at night. We just have to exercise more vigilance. Fortunately, we do have some lights that can help us out in that situation that are built into the runways in some places. We want to try and make sure that we taxi a little bit slower at night also. That can certainly help us, and knowing a little bit about our vision, our best vision is actually a little bit off of center rather than dead ahead. So we can kind of keep that into account too as we make our scan of the runway surface while we taxi. And that's it, man. I'm done.